They called it the human paradox in the galactic archives. Every other species in the known universe operated on a simple principle. When faced with overwhelming odds, you negotiate. You find middle ground. You compromise to survive another day. But humans, they had a different word for impossible odds. They called it Tuesday. The Galactic Council had spent 3 centuries cataloging every sentient race, their behavioral patterns, their breaking points, their negotiation tactics. Every species followed the same evolutionary logic, self-preservation through adaptation and compromise. It was the universal constant that held their diverse alliance together. Then humanity applied to join the council. The application should have been routine. A young species, barely 200 years into space travel, seeking membership among civilizations that had mastered faster-than-light travel for millennia. The humans should have been grateful for any terms offered, eager to compromise on territorial disputes, trade agreements, and colonial rights. Instead, they did something that shattered every diplomatic protocol in the galaxy. When told their expansion into the Kepler sector would require relocating 17 established colonies and accepting a 300-year technological embargo, the human ambassador didn't negotiate. She smiled and said 2 words that would echo through the halls of galactic power forever. Make us. What happened next wouldn't just change the balance of power in the galaxy. It would rewrite the very definition of what it meant to be human, not just for the species that thought they understood them, but for humanity itself. Because when the galaxy tried to force humanity to compromise, they discovered the truth that had been hidden in human DNA since they first looked up at the stars. Humans don't have a breaking point. They have a starting point. The assembly hall of the Galactic Council stretched for 3 kilometers in every direction, its crystalline dome offering a perfect view of the nebula-painted cosmos beyond. Representatives from 473 species sat in carefully arranged sections, each zone modified to accommodate different atmospheric and gravitational requirements. The air itself was a carefully balanced mixture that no single species found comfortable, but all could tolerate, the perfect metaphor for galactic diplomacy. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked through the entrance designated for primitive atmospheric breathers. Her simple black suit a stark contrast to the elaborate environmental suits, biomechanical augmentations, and pure energy forms that surrounded her. At 42, she had already served as humanity's primary diplomat for 8 years, long enough to recognize the calculated insult in her seating assignment. Row 847, directly behind the Zephyrian delegation, whose sulfurous emanations made breathing an exercise in controlled suffering. She had requested this meeting 6 months ago. Today, she would discover whether humanity's application for Galactic Council membership would be approved, modified, or rejected entirely. Given the whispered conversations that fell silent whenever she passed, Elena suspected she already knew the answer. The Galactic Council operated on principles established over 3 millennia of interstellar diplomacy. Every decision was reached through consensus, every conflict resolved through negotiation, every problem solved through compromise. It was a system that had brought peace to a galaxy once torn apart by species-ending wars. High Chancellor Zephyros of the Ethereal Collective materialized at the central podium, his energy form shifting through spectrums of light that conveyed meaning to those equipped with proper translation matrices. Elena's earpiece converted his communication into words, though she suspected much of the emotional nuance was lost in translation. We gather today to address the application of the species designation, human, for membership in the Galactic Council, Zephyros announced. After extensive review of their technological capabilities, territorial holdings, and cultural assessment, the Council has reached a decision. Elena kept her expression neutral, though she noticed several nearby ambassadors turning to observe her reaction. The Vorthak representative, an insectoid creature whose compound eyes could detect microexpressions across 17 different emotional spectrums, leaned forward with obvious interest. The human species shows promise, Zephyros continued, but lacks the experience and stability required for full membership. However, the Council recognizes their potential and extends an offer of associate status, contingent on the following terms. Elena's tablet lit up with the transmitted document. She scanned the terms quickly, her diplomatic training allowing her to process the complex legal language while maintaining her composed exterior. But inside, a cold fury began to build. The terms were worse than she had anticipated. Humanity would be granted limited representation, one non-voting observer position on the council. Their territorial expansion would be frozen at current levels, with all 17 human colonies in the Kepler sector to be evacuated within one standard year to make room for Zephyrian territorial expansion. Earth's solar system would remain sovereign human territory, but all research into faster-than-light communication and advanced weaponry would be suspended for 3 centuries, subject to council monitoring. Most insulting of all, humans would be required to submit to cultural integration sessions, designed to help them understand proper galactic diplomacy, sessions that amounted to re-education camps for their entire diplomatic corps. The human representative will now provide their species' response, Zephyros announced. Elena stood slowly, her movement precise and deliberate. Every eye, sensor, and consciousness in the vast chamber focused on her. She walked to the primitive species podium, a deliberately smaller platform positioned lower than the others, and activated the audio enhancement system. "Honorable members of the Galactic Council," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. "I thank you for your consideration of humanity's application." A collective sense of relief seemed to emanate from the assembly. This was how these meetings always went. The younger species expressed gratitude, accepted whatever terms were offered, and began the long process of integration into galactic society. "However," Elena continued, and the atmosphere in the chamber shifted noticeably, "I must respectfully decline your generous offer." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the environmental system seemed to pause, as if the station itself was holding its breath. High Chancellor Zephyros flickered through several spectrums of confusion before settling on a deep purple that Elena's translator informed her indicated severe diplomatic concern. "Ambassador Vasquez, perhaps there has been a translation error. You are declining membership in the Galactic Council." "Not membership," Elena clarified, her voice steady. "We're declining your terms. We came here seeking full membership as equals, not subordinate status as your junior partners. We will not evacuate our colonies, we will not limit our technological development, and we certainly will not submit to cultural re-education." The Vorthak representative's mandibles clicked in what Elena's cultural briefings had identified as either amusement or extreme agitation. Around the chamber, other delegates were consulting with their advisors in hushed, urgent tones. Chancellor Zephyros brightened to an alarming shade of white. "Ambassador, I believe you misunderstand the nature of our offer. This is not a negotiation. The Council has made its decision based on careful evaluation of your species' capabilities and needs. These terms ensure humanity's peaceful integration into galactic society while preventing the conflicts that have historically arisen when primitive species expand too quickly." Elena smiled, an expression that seemed to disturb several of the nearby delegates. "Chancellor, I believe you misunderstand the nature of my response. We're not asking for your permission to exist as free beings in this galaxy. We're informing you that we intend to do so regardless of your approval." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Delegates throughout the chamber began speaking at once, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony that overwhelmed even the translation systems. Some species emitted distress pheromones that triggered atmospheric warnings. Others generated electromagnetic pulses that interfered with nearby electronics. Above it all, Chancellor Zephyros blazed with an intensity that forced Elena to squint. "This is unprecedented. No species has ever rejected council oversight. The terms we offer are generous, more generous than those extended to most associate applicants. Your colonies in the Kepler sector encroach on established Zephyrian territorial claims. Your rapid technological development presents risks that must be managed. These are not arbitrary restrictions, but necessary safeguards for galactic stability." "Respectfully, Chancellor, that's not our problem," Elena replied. "Our colonies were established in unclaimed space, following all established protocols. Our technological development is our sovereign right as a free species, and galactic stability isn't enhanced by forcing one species to surrender its rights to appease another." The Zephyrian ambassador suddenly materialized beside the High Chancellor. a breach of protocol that indicated extreme agitation. The Zephyrians were among the Council's most influential members, their territorial expansion having been supported by the Council for over a millennium. The idea that a primitive species might refuse to accommodate their claims was clearly beyond their comprehension. The humans must be made to understand, the Zephyrian ambassador communicated through rapid light pulses. The Kepler sector has been designated for Zephyrian expansion for 2 centuries. Their presence there is a temporary aberration that must be corrected. Elena's smile widened slightly. Ambassador, our presence in the Kepler sector isn't an aberration. It's a reality. Our colonies are thriving, our people are happy, and we have absolutely no intention of abandoning them to satisfy your expansion plans. The Altarian representative, a crystalline being whose species valued logical discourse above all else, chimed in with mathematical precision. The probability of successful human resistance to Council enforcement action is 0.0034%, with a margin of error of 0.0001%. Their technological capabilities are insufficient to challenge even a minimal Council peacekeeping force. Logic suggests they will recognize this reality and accept the offered terms. Elena turned to face the Altarian delegation directly. Ambassador, your calculations are based on current human technological capabilities. They don't account for human innovation under pressure, human determination when cornered, or human creativity when told something is impossible. Innovation requires time, the Altarian replied with the patience of a species that thought in geological timescales. Determination without capability is meaningless. Creativity cannot overcome mathematical certainties. Maybe not, Elena agreed, but stubbornness can work miracles. High Chancellor Zephyros dimmed to a deep red that Elena's translator identified as either deep concern or impending rage. Ambassador Vasquez, I urge you to reconsider. The Council's enforcement capabilities are vast. We have maintained galactic peace for 3 millennia precisely because we do not allow individual species to defy collective decisions. If humans refuse to accept these terms voluntarily, they will be implemented by force. The chamber fell silent again, waiting for Elena's response. This was the moment when every previous primitive species had recognized the reality of their situation and capitulated. The threat of Council enforcement had never failed to bring stubborn species into line. Elena took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and looked directly into the swirling energies of the High Chancellor. Chancellor, let me be absolutely clear about humanity's position. We came here in good faith, seeking partnership among equals. We've been offered subjugation disguised as protection. We decline. She paused, letting her words register through every translation system in the chamber. If the Galactic Council believes it can force free human beings to abandon their homes, surrender their rights, and submit to your authority, then by all means make the attempt. But understand this. Humanity has never bowed to threats, never surrendered to superior force, and never accepted that impossible means anything more than difficult. The silence stretched for long moments. Then Elena spoke the words that would be recorded in galactic history as the moment everything changed. We are not asking for your permission to be free. We are informing you that we refuse to be enslaved. And if that means war, then so be it. But we will not compromise our sovereignty, we will not abandon our people, and we will not accept your terms. She closed her tablet and began walking toward the exit. When you're ready to negotiate as equals, you know where to find us. Until then, humanity will continue doing what it has always done, pursuing our own path, regardless of who thinks we should choose differently. Elena's footsteps echoed in the vast chamber as she walked through the primitive species exit. Behind her, the Galactic Council erupted into chaos as delegates tried to comprehend what had just happened. For the first time in 3,000 years, a species had said no. And meant it. The emergency session of the Galactic Council Security Committee convened within hours of Elena's departure, gathering in the high-security chambers beneath the main assembly hall. Unlike the grand public forum above, this room was designed for practical military planning. Holographic displays showed real-time fleet positions, territorial boundaries, and tactical assessments. Representatives from the Council's major military powers materialized or arrived through teleportation gates, their forms reflecting the gravity of the situation. Admiral Thranks of the Hegemony Defense Force, a towering reptilian being whose scales had been battle-scarred across 3 centuries of conflict, activated the central display. The human sphere of influence appeared as a small cluster of systems in the galactic arm, 17 colonies connected by shipping lanes, with Earth glowing at the center like a defiant ember. "The situation requires immediate correction," Admiral Thranks declared, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the chamber's acoustic systems. "Never in recorded galactic history has a primitive species openly defied Council authority. If we allow this precedent to stand, it could encourage other junior species to question Council decisions." General Vexter of the Ethereal Military Command flickered through combat-ready spectrums. "The humans possess no significant military assets. Their largest vessels are primitive fusion-powered craft incapable of faster-than-light combat maneuvers. A single Council dreadnought could neutralize their entire fleet within hours." The tactical display zoomed in on human space, revealing the pathetic military reality. Earth's defense fleet consisted of 47 vessels, the largest barely 300 meters long. The colonial defense networks were even more limited: mining stations converted to patrol boats, cargo haulers equipped with improvised weapons, orbital platforms that wouldn't last minutes against proper military vessels. Commander Xyloth of the Synthetic Coalition processed the data with mechanical precision. Human military capabilities are negligible. However, their response pattern suggests irrationality that defies standard behavioral models. Recommend psychological analysis before proceeding with enforcement action. Dr. Cathara, the Council's chief xenopsychologist, materialized at the conference table. Her gaseous form shifted through thoughtful blues and greens as she accessed the accumulated data on human behavior. "I've been studying human cultural patterns since their first contact. They exhibit several concerning psychological traits that distinguish them from other species." The display shifted to show historical analysis, graphs, behavioral models, and psychological profiles that had been compiled over decades of observation. The data painted a picture of a species that seemed almost designed to confound galactic norms. "Most species develop space travel after achieving global unity and eliminating internal conflict," Dr. Cathara explained. "Humans achieved interstellar flight while still actively fighting wars on their homeworld. Their entire developmental pattern suggests a species that thrives on conflict rather than avoiding it." Admiral Thranks's tail lashed with impatience. "Irrelevant. Every species believes it's unique until faced with overwhelming force. The humans will capitulate once they understand the reality of their situation." "That's precisely what concerns me," Dr. Cathara replied. "Human historical records show a consistent pattern. The greater the pressure applied to their species, the more violently they resist. They have a documented history of fighting to extinction rather than accepting terms they consider unacceptable." The chamber fell silent as the implications registered. The Council's enforcement model relied on rational species making rational choices when faced with superior force. The threat of annihilation was supposed to bring compliance, not trigger suicidal resistance. General Vexter brightened to aggressive orange. "Then we simply apply sufficient force to eliminate resistance entirely, a demonstration of power that leaves no room for irrational defiance." "That would constitute genocide," Commander Xyloth pointed out with synthetic calm. "Council protocols prohibit extinction-level enforcement actions against sentient species unless they pose an existential threat to galactic stability." "They defy Council authority," Admiral Thranks growled. "That is the definition of a threat to galactic stability." The debate continued for hours, but the practical reality was clear. The humans had rejected Council terms and shown no indication of reconsidering. Military enforcement was the only remaining option, despite the psychological concerns. Meanwhile, in human space, the reaction to Alina's report was everything the Council's analysts would have predicted, and nothing they were prepared for. The emergency session of the Human Colonial Authority met in the orbital station above Earth, with representatives attending virtually from across human space. Alina's transmission had reached every human colony simultaneously, along with the complete record of Council proceedings and the terms that had been rejected. President Sarah Chen of the Colonial Authority looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from realizing your species' future hung in the balance. "Let me make sure I understand the situation. We asked to join their club, they offered to make us servants instead, and Alina told them where they could stick their offer. That's an accurate summary, Alina replied from the communications link aboard her transport ship, still 3 days out from Earth. The Council expects compliance within 30 standard days. After that, they'll send enforcement fleets to implement their terms by force. The colonial representatives reacted exactly as the Council's psychological profiles suggested they would. Rather than panic or seek compromise, they began planning for war. Director Marcus Webb of the Kepler Colonial Defense Force leaned forward. What kind of enforcement are we talking about? Police action or full military response? Unknown, Alina replied. But given their reaction to outright defiance, I suspect they'll want to make an example of us. Overwhelming force designed to demonstrate the consequences of challenging council authority. Governor Lisa Park of the New Sydney colony asked the question everyone was thinking. What are our chances? The silence stretched uncomfortably before Admiral James Morrison of Earth Defense Command answered honestly. Against the full Galactic Council? Effectively zero. They have thousands of ships, advanced weapons technology centuries beyond ours, and experience fighting wars across interstellar distances. In a conventional military confrontation, we'd last about as long as it takes them to get here. So we don't fight conventionally, said Dr. Angela Foster, head of the Human Research Consortium. We've known this day might come since first contact. Every human research facility has been working on projects that officially don't exist. The conference room's displays activated, showing classified research data that made Alina's eyebrows rise even through the transmission lag. Prototype weapons, experimental defensive systems, and theoretical technologies that push the boundaries of known physics. The Mira project has produced functional cloaking devices for ships up to destroyer size, Dr. Foster continued. The Prometheus initiative has developed fusion warheads with yields exceeding anything in our current arsenal. The Hermes program has achieved breakthrough results in faster-than-light communication, arrays that don't rely on council-controlled networks. President Chen studied the data with growing amazement. How long have these projects been active? Since the Council first made contact, Dr. Foster replied. We hoped for peaceful integration, but we prepared for the alternative. Human nature, President Chen. We don't like putting all our eggs in one basket. Admiral Morrison was already analyzing the tactical implications. Even with these advances, we're still facing overwhelming numbers. Council fleets could blockade every human system simultaneously. Then we don't defend systems, Colonel Zhang Wei of Special Operations Command interjected. We make them pay for every victory. Guerrilla warfare on an interstellar scale. Hit their supply lines, target their communication networks, make occupation too expensive to maintain. The debate that followed would have horrified the Council's psychological experts. Rather than seeking ways to avoid conflict, the human leadership was actively planning for total war. They discussed targeting civilian council infrastructure, disrupting trade routes, and turning every human colony into a fortress that would cost more to capture than it was worth. But it was Governor Park who raised the point that changed everything. We're thinking about this wrong. The Council expects us to either surrender or fight a conventional war we can't win. What if we do neither? Explain, President Chen requested. They want to force us to evacuate the Kepler sector and accept technological limitations. What if we just don't? What if we simply continue as if their demands don't exist? Dr. Foster caught on immediately. Passive resistance on a species level. We don't attack their forces, but we don't comply with their orders either. Make them decide whether they're willing to commit genocide to enforce their authority. That's incredibly dangerous, Alina warned from the communication link. If they call our bluff and attack anyway, we'll have no military response prepared. Admiral Morrison smiled grimly. Actually, it's perfect. If they attack non-resistant colonies, they're the aggressors committing war crimes. If they don't attack, their authority means nothing. Either way, we force them to show the galaxy their true face. The plan that emerged from that meeting was uniquely human in its audacity. Rather than preparing for war or seeking compromise, humanity would simply ignore the Council's existence entirely. Human colonies would continue normal operations, human ships would maintain their trade routes, and human research would proceed without Council oversight. But beneath the surface, preparations continued for the war everyone knew was coming. Every human colony began converting civilian infrastructure to military purposes. Mining stations became weapons factories. Cargo haulers were retrofitted with concealed armaments. Agricultural ships received hidden missile launchers. The most ambitious project was Dr. Foster's proposal for the Genesis Protocol, a plan that would ensure human survival even if Earth and every colony were destroyed. Hidden caches of human genetic material, cultural archives, and technological databases would be scattered throughout the galaxy, waiting for the day when humanity could rise again. 3 weeks after Alina's defiant speech, the first Council enforcement fleet arrived at the edge of human space. The massive task force included 12 dreadnoughts, 47 cruisers, and over 200 support vessels, enough firepower to reduce every human world to ash within hours. Admiral Threnx commanded from the dreadnought Inevitable Asterisk, a vessel that had broken the resistance of 17 different species over the past 2 centuries. As his fleet took position at the outer boundaries of the Sol system, he opened communication channels to Earth. "This is Admiral Threnx of the Galactic Council Enforcement Division. I am authorized to implement Security Resolution 847 regarding human compliance with Council directives. You have 1 standard hour to begin evacuation procedures for all colonies in the Kepler sector and to surrender all restricted technological research for Council oversight." The response came not from Earth's government, but from every human colony simultaneously. The same message, broadcast on every frequency: "This is humanity. We decline your offer. Have a nice day." Admiral Threnx had expected defiance, but the casual dismissal was somehow more infuriating than rage would have been. His scales darkened with battle fury as he opened fleet communications. "All vessels prepare for enforcement operations. Target military installations only. We will show these primitives the consequences of defying Council authority, but we are not barbarians." But as the Council fleet moved deeper into human space, Admiral Threnx began to realize that the humans had already shown him something he wasn't prepared for: a species that genuinely didn't care how overwhelming the odds against them were. And in the depths of space, hidden human observation posts began transmitting a single message to every corner of the galaxy: "The war for human freedom has begun. We invite all species who value liberty to watch how this ends." The first shots of the Human Council War were fired at 14:27 Universal Standard Time, when Admiral Threnx's flagship targeted the orbital defense platforms above New Geneva Colony. The massive particle beams, designed to disable rather than destroy, struck the seemingly defenseless installations with enough energy to power a small star. The platforms exploded as expected. What Admiral Threnx didn't expect was for each explosion to release a cloud of microscopic nanobots that immediately began replicating using debris from his own weapon's fire. Within minutes, the Council fleet found itself surrounded by a swarm of self-replicating machines that began interfering with sensor arrays, communication systems, and navigation computers. The nanobots weren't weapons in any conventional sense. They simply made it increasingly difficult for the massive Council vessels to coordinate their attacks or maintain formation. "Report!" Admiral Threnx roared as his command displays began flickering with interference. "Unknown technological countermeasure," his tactical officer replied, mandibles clicking with agitation. "The human defense platforms contained some form of retaliatory system not detected by our scans. Recommend immediate retreat to safe distance for analysis." "Retreat," Threnx's scales flared with indignation. "From a primitive species that shouldn't even possess faster-than-light communication. Continue the attack." But the nanobots were already adapting, learning from each interaction with Council technology. Ships that had dominated battlefields for centuries found themselves effectively blind, their sophisticated targeting systems confused by clouds of interference that seemed to anticipate their every move. On New Geneva's surface, Dr. Rebecca Martinez watched the orbital battle from the colony's command center. As lead designer of the nanobot defense system, she felt a grim satisfaction seeing her theoretical work prove effective against overwhelming odds. "How long will the interference last?" Colony Administrator David Thompson asked, his eyes fixed on the tactical displays showing the massive Council fleet struggling with coordination. "Unknown," Rebecca replied honestly. The nanobots are programmed to adapt and replicate using available resources. Theoretically, they could maintain interference indefinitely as long as the Council fleet keeps providing raw materials through weapons fire. Outside the command center, New Geneva's 14,000 colonists continued their daily routines with a stubborn normalcy that would have baffled the Council's psychological experts. Schools remained open, farmers tended their crops, and the colony's fusion reactor continued powering normal operations. The only concession to the battle raging overhead was the activation of underground shelters, not for evacuation, but as temporary housing in case orbital bombardment made surface living uncomfortable. Similar scenes played out across every human colony. The Council's enforcement fleets arrived expecting to find panicked populations ready to surrender rather than face annihilation. Instead, they encountered communities that had simply decided to ignore the existence of superior firepower. On New Sydney, Governor Lisa Park broadcast daily updates to her colony's 89,000 residents. Council fleet remains in orbit, making threatening gestures. Today's harvest projections remain on schedule. The Henderson family welcomes their new daughter, and the Youth Soccer League Championship will proceed as planned. The psychological impact on Council forces was immediate and profound. Soldiers trained to break resistance through overwhelming force found themselves facing opponents who seemed genuinely indifferent to the threat of death. Worse, the humans' casual dismissal of Council authority was being broadcast throughout the galaxy, where other species watched with growing fascination. Admiral Threnx finally managed to restore communications after 6 hours of technological chaos, during which his invincible fleet had been effectively neutralized by what amounted to a cloud of cosmic dust. His rage was transcendent as he opened channels to the human colonies. "This ends now. Surrender immediately or face complete annihilation." The response came from New Geneva's colony administrator. "Admiral, we appreciate your concern, but we're quite comfortable here. Perhaps you should consider withdrawing your fleet before our defensive systems cause permanent damage to your vessels." It was a bluff. The nanobots had already reached their replication limits and would dissipate within hours. But Threnx didn't know that, and the casual confidence in the human's voice suggested reserves of power that his sensors couldn't detect. The stalemate that followed became known as the Week of Waiting. Council fleets surrounded human colonies, but hesitated to attack, knowing that their overwhelming technological superiority had somehow been neutralized by an opponent they barely understood. Meanwhile, human colonies continued normal operations while broadcasting their daily routines to an increasingly attentive galactic audience. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a theoretical physicist working on New Tokyo Colony's deep space communication array. While monitoring Council fleet positions, she discovered something that changed humanity's understanding of galactic politics forever. "They're not talking to each other," she reported to the Colonial Defense Committee via secure quantum link. "The Council fleets maintain perfect radio silence except for official battle communications, but I've been monitoring their data streams, and there's something odd about their information flow patterns." Admiral Morrison, coordinating humanity's defense from Earth, leaned forward. "Explain." "Every major decision has to be approved by the home governments of each species involved. The fleet commanders can't act independently. They're essentially puppets receiving instructions from politicians sitting safely in their home systems, light years away from any actual danger." The implications were staggering. The Council's mighty fleets were hamstrung by a command structure designed for managing diplomatic negotiations, not fighting wars against opponents who refused to follow established rules. Dr. Foster immediately saw the opportunity. "How long does it take for them to receive new orders?" "Depends on distance," Dr. Tanaka replied. "But for most of the fleets currently in human space, we're talking about days or even weeks for command decisions to flow from their home governments to local commanders." "Then we don't give them time to think," Admiral Morrison declared. "We force them to make decisions faster than their political systems can handle." The strategy that emerged was uniquely human. Rather than fighting the Council's superior technology, humanity would exploit their political weaknesses. Small, fast human vessels would strike at targets throughout the galaxy, forcing the Council to respond to dozens of simultaneous crises, while their command structure struggled to coordinate responses across interstellar distances. The campaign began with what became known as the Midnight Run, a simultaneous strike by 47 human vessels against Council supply depots, communication relays, and administrative stations throughout the galaxy. The attacks weren't designed to cause massive damage, but rather to force Council forces to spread their fleets across hundreds of systems while their governments debated appropriate responses. Captain Maria Santos commanded the New Horizon Asterisk, a converted cargo hauler that had been transformed into humanity's first true stealth warship. Her target was a Council communication relay in the Vega system, a seemingly impregnable station that coordinated military communications across an entire sector. "Approaching target," her navigator reported. "No indication we've been detected." The New Horizons Asterisk experimental cloaking system was a marvel of human ingenuity, not true invisibility, but rather a sophisticated method of appearing to be something else entirely. To Council sensors, the human warship registered as a minor asteroid drifting through space. "Weapon status?" Captain Santos asked. "All systems ready. Single fusion torpedo loaded and targeted." The station ahead was massive, a crystalline structure that pulsed with energy as it relayed communications across light years of space. It was defended by automated systems designed to destroy conventional attackers, but those systems were scanning for military vessels, not civilian cargo haulers broadcasting mining survey data. "Fire!" The fusion torpedo struck the station's primary communication array with devastating precision. The explosion was visible from several neighboring systems, and the communication disruption immediately affected Council military coordination across 6 sectors. Similar attacks were playing out throughout the galaxy as human raiders struck targets that had never been considered vulnerable. Council fleets found themselves blind and isolated, unable to coordinate responses, while their home governments debated whether the attacks constituted an act of war or elaborate terrorism. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Elena Vasquez, still aboard her diplomatic transport, made an unscheduled stop at the Altarian homeworld. The crystalline beings who valued logic above all else agreed to meet with her, more out of curiosity than any diplomatic courtesy. "Your species exhibits behavior patterns that defy rational analysis," High Crystalline Tethara informed her through mathematical harmonics that hurt Elena's teeth. "We wish to understand the logical basis for your actions." Elena smiled the same smile that had unnerved the entire Council assembly. "There isn't one. We're not acting logically, we're acting human." "Explain this concept." "Logic assumes that rational beings will choose survival over principle when faced with extinction. But humans aren't entirely rational. We're capable of choosing death over surrender, not because it makes sense, but because some things matter more than survival." The Altarian's crystalline form resonated with confusion. What could be more valuable than continued existence? "Freedom," Elena replied simply. "The right to make our own choices, even if they're wrong. The right to succeed or fail on our own terms. The right to tell anyone who thinks they own us that we'd rather die free than live as slaves." The conversation that followed lasted 18 hours and fundamentally altered the Altarian understanding of galactic politics. When it concluded, the logical crystalline beings made an announcement that shocked the galaxy. They formally withdrew from the Galactic Council, citing irreconcilable differences regarding the nature of sentient rights. The Altarian withdrawal triggered the first real crisis in Council history. Within days, 17 other species announced their intention to reconsider their Council membership status. The mighty alliance that had maintained galactic peace for 3 millennia was beginning to fracture along ideological lines. Admiral Thranks, still trapped in the Sol system by nanobots and political paralysis, received an urgent communication from Council headquarters. "Terminate enforcement operations immediately. Return all fleets to defensive positions. Do not engage human forces unless directly attacked." But it was too late. Humanity had already demonstrated that the Council's power rested on consensus, not force. And once that consensus began to crack, the entire structure of galactic authority started to crumble. On Earth, President Chen addressed the colonial authority with weary satisfaction. "Phase 1 is complete. The Council is in political chaos, their fleets are scattered and demoralized, and 18 species have formally challenged their authority. "What's Phase 2?" Admiral Morrison asked. Alina's voice came through the communication link, transmitting from the Altarian homeworld. "Now we prove that freedom is contagious. We help every species in the galaxy remember what it feels like to make their own choices." The war for human freedom was about to become something much larger. A galactic revolution that would determine whether sentient beings had the right to determine their own destiny, or whether superior force would always triumph over individual liberty. And in the depths of space, hidden human observation posts continued broadcasting to the galaxy. "This is what resistance looks like. This is what freedom costs. Are you willing to pay the price?" The Galactic Council emergency session that convened 3 months after humanity's first raid was unlike anything in recorded history. Instead of the usual orderly assembly of 473 species, only 312 representatives appeared. Of those, 127 attended virtually while maintaining observer status, and another 89 sent junior diplomats rather than their primary ambassadors, a diplomatic insult that spoke volumes about their commitment to council authority. High Chancellor Zephyros materialized at the central podium, his energy form flickering through spectrums that indicated extreme stress. The past 3 months had aged him considerably, though few species could read the subtle indicators in his luminous patterns. "The human crisis has reached unacceptable proportions," he announced, his words carrying through translation systems that were now operating at reduced capacity due to ongoing communication disruptions. "Their terrorist activities have damaged or destroyed 347 council installations, disrupted trade routes throughout 6 sectors, and directly contributed to the withdrawal of 18 member species." The reaction was immediate but fragmented. Where once the council chamber would have erupted in unified condemnation, now debates broke out along species lines. The Zephyrians demanded immediate military retaliation. The remaining Altarian observers suggested logical reconsideration of fundamental assumptions. The Vorthak delegation clicked their mandibles in patterns that roughly translated to, "We warned you this would happen." What troubled the Chancellor most was the behavior of species that had previously been Council stalwarts. The Meridian Collective, whose vast trade networks depended on Council-maintained shipping lanes, had begun negotiating separate peace agreements with human raiders rather than relying on Council protection. The Synthetic Coalition had started requesting detailed analyses of human tactical innovations, for academic purposes only. Most disturbing of all, several member species had begun implementing what they called human-style independence protocols, essentially ignoring Council directives while maintaining nominal membership. Admiral Threnx took his place at the military briefing station, his scarred scales bearing fresh marks from the ongoing nightmare of trying to combat human forces with a command structure designed for conventional diplomacy. "The humans are not fighting a war," he reported grimly. "They are conducting what their military manuals call asymmetric liberation campaigns. They strike our infrastructure, broadcast the attack throughout the galaxy, then disappear before we can respond. But each attack is coordinated with diplomatic outreach to local species, offering them alternatives to Council membership." The tactical displays showed the scope of human operations. Red indicators marked successful raids across 17 sectors. Blue zones indicated areas where local species had begun reconsidering their relationship with Council authority. Green markers showed regions where human diplomatic teams were actively recruiting new allies. "Most concerning," Admiral Threnx continued, "is their use of captured Council personnel. Rather than executing prisoners or holding them for ransom, the humans provide them with detailed tour of human colonies, complete access to human cultural archives, and opportunities to observe human society operating without Council oversight." General Vexter's energy form brightened to confused orange. "What purpose does this serve?" "Every prisoner we've recovered returns with detailed reports about human society that directly contradict our intelligence assessments. They describe a species that appears genuinely happy without central authority, technologically innovative despite resource limitations, and socially stable despite their lack of hierarchical control structures." The implications were staggering. Council propaganda had always portrayed species independence as a recipe for chaos and war. The human colonies were living proof that advanced civilizations could thrive without council management, and every released prisoner became an unwitting advocate for human-style freedom. Dr. Cathara materialized to present her psychological analysis, her gaseous form cycling through worried purples and greens. The human diplomatic strategy is unprecedented in its sophistication. They are not trying to defeat the council militarily. They are trying to make council authority irrelevant by demonstrating superior alternatives. The displays shifted to show polling data from across the galaxy. Public opinion regarding council authority had plummeted in systems exposed to human broadcasts. Support for increased local autonomy had risen dramatically among species that had never previously questioned council oversight. More disturbing, Dr. Cathara continued, is the psychological profile of the humans themselves. Extended observation suggests they genuinely do not understand why species would voluntarily surrender their freedom for security. They appear to consider independence a fundamental biological drive, like hunger or reproduction. Chancellor Zephyros dimmed with frustration. Surely they must have recognized the military impossibility of their position by now. No species can sustain conflict against the entire galaxy indefinitely. That assumption may be flawed, Dr. Cathara replied. Human historical records show multiple instances where they fought impossible wars for decades, sometimes centuries, simply because surrender was considered unacceptable. Their species may literally be incapable of capitulation. Meanwhile, in human space, the impossible war was taking on characteristics that confused even humanity's own leadership. Admiral Morrison stood in the command center aboard the orbital station New Defiance Asterisk, studying tactical reports that defied conventional military logic. "We're winning," he announced to the assembled Colonial Defense Committee. "I have no idea how, but we're actually winning." The strategic situation was indeed extraordinary. Human forces numbered fewer than 10,000 combat personnel scattered across 47 active vessels. They faced Council fleets totaling over 50,000 warships crewed by millions of experienced military personnel. By every measure of conventional warfare, humanity should have been crushed within weeks. Instead, the Council was losing. "Explain the current tactical position," President Chen requested from Earth. Colonel Zhang Wei activated the strategic displays. "Council forces are paralyzed by political infighting. Every military decision requires approval from member species' home governments, but those governments can't agree on basic strategic objectives. Some want to negotiate, others demand total victory, and a growing faction wants to withdraw from the conflict entirely." Meanwhile, Captain Santos added via communication link from deep space, "Their forces are spread across hundreds of systems trying to protect infrastructure they never imagined would be vulnerable. They're fighting the war they prepared for, not the war we're actually fighting." But the real victory was happening at levels deeper than military tactics. Dr. Foster presented data that showed humanity's true achievement. "We're not just winning battles, we're winning the argument." Species throughout the galaxy are questioning fundamental assumptions about government, authority, and individual rights that have gone unchallenged for millennia. The evidence was overwhelming. In the Kepler sector, the Zephyrian colonies had begun demanding representation in decisions affecting their worlds. Throughout the Altarian territories, local crystalline communities were conducting logical analyses of governance alternatives. Even within core council systems, younger members of established species were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about who had the right to make decisions for others. Elena Vasquez, now operating as humanity's roving ambassador, reported from her current location in the neutral zone. "I've met with representatives from 43 species in the past month. The question they all ask is the same. How do the humans govern themselves without a central authority telling them what to do? They're not interested in human military technology. They want to understand human political philosophy." The conversation that followed revealed the scope of what humanity had accidentally triggered. By refusing to accept council authority, they had forced every species in the galaxy to examine the basis of that authority. And increasingly, species were concluding that they had surrendered their freedom in exchange for security they could provide for themselves. "Phase 3 begins now," President Chen announced. "We established the Free Species Alliance, a voluntary association of worlds committed to self-governance and mutual defense against tyranny." The proposal was audacious, beyond anything humanity had previously attempted. Rather than simply fighting for their own freedom, they would create an alternative to the Council that demonstrated the viability of voluntary cooperation between truly independent civilizations. Admiral Morrison raised the obvious concern: we'll be painting targets on every species that joins us. The Council will view the Alliance as an existential threat. Good, Alina replied from across the galaxy. Let them try to suppress freedom throughout the entire galaxy. Every species they threaten will have to choose between submission and independence, and we've already proven that independence is contagious. The formation of the Free Species Alliance sent shockwaves through galactic civilization. Within days of the announcement, 12 species formally requested membership. Within weeks, the number had grown to 37. Within 2 months, the Alliance represented nearly a quarter of all known sentient civilizations. But it was the Alliance's founding charter that truly revolutionized galactic politics. The document, drafted primarily by Alina with input from legal scholars across dozens of species, established principles that directly challenged every assumption underlying Council authority. No sentient being shall be compelled to accept governance without consent. No species shall surrender sovereignty in exchange for security. No civilization shall be denied the right to determine its own path among the stars. And no authority, regardless of its size or power, shall be permitted to impose its will upon those who choose freedom over subjugation. The Council's response was swift and predictable. Chancellor Zephyros declared the Alliance an illegal conspiracy against galactic stability and authorized military action against all member species. But the military reality had changed dramatically during the months of human resistance. Council fleets, designed to overwhelm primitive opponents through superior firepower, found themselves facing coordinated resistance from dozens of species using human-inspired tactics. The Altarians applied mathematical precision to guerrilla warfare. The Vorthak used their sensory advantages to conduct perfect reconnaissance missions. The Meridians turned their trade networks into supply lines for resistance operations. Most devastating of all, human technical advisors had spent months teaching Alliance species the same lesson that had allowed humanity to survive. Superior technology meant nothing if your political system prevented you from using it effectively. Admiral Thranks, commanding what remained of the once mighty Council Enforcement Division, found himself fighting a war that existed primarily in the imagination. Alliance forces rarely engaged Council fleets directly. Instead, they simply continued their normal activities while broadcasting messages that invited Council soldiers to defect, Council species to reconsider their allegiances, and Council civilians to visit Alliance worlds to see freedom in action. The psychological warfare was devastating. Council military personnel, indoctrinated to believe they were defending civilization against chaos, instead found themselves trying to force free beings back into captivity. Defection rates soared. Morale plummeted. Entire battle groups began requesting reassignment to less politically complex duties. But it was the message that appeared simultaneously on every communication network throughout the galaxy that marked the true turning point in the war. To every sentient being in the galaxy, you were born free. Your freedom is not a gift from any government, council, or authority. It is your natural state as a thinking being. Anyone who tells you that you must surrender your freedom for your own good is lying. Anyone who claims the right to make decisions for you without your consent is a tyrant. And anyone who uses force to compel your obedience is your enemy. The Free Species Alliance exists to defend one simple principle. You have the right to choose your own destiny. We do not ask you to join us, follow us, or obey us. We ask only that you remember what it feels like to be free and decide for yourself whether that feeling is worth preserving. This message is brought to you by humanity, a species that discovered long ago that freedom is not something you negotiate for, compromise about, or accept substitutes for. Freedom is something you take, hold, and defend with everything you have. The choice is yours, choose wisely. The message was signed simply: Elena Vasquez, ambassador for the Free Species Alliance and the last human who will ever bow to unelected authority. By the time Council forces managed to trace and block the transmission, it had been received by every inhabited world in the galaxy. The revolution humanity had started was no longer about human independence. It had become a galactic awakening to the possibility of universal freedom. and in the deepest levels of the Council's most secure facilities, emergency protocols were being activated as leadership realized they were no longer fighting a war against humanity. They were fighting a war against the very concept of liberty itself. 1 year after Elena Vasquez walked out of the Galactic Council Assembly, the galaxy bore little resemblance to the ordered civilization that had existed for 3 millennia. The carefully maintained balance of power had shattered, replaced by a chaotic patchwork of free alliance territories, council-controlled sectors, and vast regions where local species were conducting their own experiments in self-governance. The statistics alone told the story of unprecedented change. The Free Species Alliance now included 127 civilizations, spanning nearly half the galaxy. The Galactic Council had contracted to 89 member species, with 12 more in various stages of withdrawal. Trade routes that had operated under Council oversight for centuries now functioned through voluntary cooperation agreements between independent worlds. Faster-than-light communication networks had been decentralized into hundreds of smaller systems that no single authority could monitor or control. Most remarkably, the galaxy hadn't descended into chaos. Council propaganda had always insisted that central authority was necessary to prevent species-ending wars, but the opposite appeared to be true. Species that governed themselves seemed more inclined toward peaceful cooperation than those forced to obey distant bureaucrats. High Chancellor Zephyros materialized in what remained of the council chambers, now operating from a mobile command station rather than the grand assembly halls that had been abandoned when most species stopped attending sessions. His energy form cycled through spectrums of exhaustion and defeat as he addressed the emergency leadership meeting. "We have two choices," he announced to the handful of remaining council representatives. "Accept the new reality and negotiate a peaceful transition to whatever galactic order emerges from this chaos, or implement Final Protocol 7. The silence that followed was absolute. Final Protocol 7 was the Council's ultimate contingency plan, a coordinated military campaign designed to crush all opposition through overwhelming force, regardless of casualties. It had never been used because its implementation would result in the destruction of entire civilizations and potentially destabilize galactic civilization for millennia. Admiral Threnx spoke first, his scarred scales reflecting the exhaustion of fighting an unwinnable war for months. Final Protocol 7 requires the participation of at least 300 member species to generate sufficient military force. We currently have active support from fewer than 50 species, and most of those are questioning their commitment. General Vexter's energy form flickered through aggressive oranges and reds. Then we use automated systems, the ancient weaponry stored in the deep vaults, weapons that don't require massive fleets or political consensus, just the will to use them. Dr. Cathara materialized in frantic opposition, her gaseous form cycling through every spectrum of alarm. The deep vault weapons were banned by galactic treaty for good reason. They're designed to sterilize entire star systems. Using them would make us the very monsters we claim to be protecting the galaxy from. But the debate was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. Elena Vasquez stepped through the chamber's entrance, not through any teleportation system, but walking normally through the physical doorway like any other solid being. The casual impossibility of her presence sent shock waves through the assembled leadership. "How did you get here?" Admiral Threnx demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward weapons that weren't present in the diplomatic chamber. "This station is protected by the most sophisticated defense systems in the galaxy." Elena smiled the same infuriating smile that had started the entire conflict. "Admiral, when you design your security to keep out fleets and armies, you sometimes overlook individual humans who just want to talk." She took a seat at the conference table uninvited, her simple diplomatic attire contrasting sharply with the elaborate technological interfaces used by the other representatives. "I came to discuss surrender terms." The room exploded in indignation. Multiple representatives began speaking at once, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony that overwhelmed even the advanced translation systems. Through it all, Elena sat calmly, waiting for the outrage to subside. Chancellor Zephyros blazed to white-hot intensity. "Surrender terms? You represent a handful of primitive colonies that should have been crushed months ago. What possible terms could you offer that we would consider?" "Not terms you would accept," Elena clarified. Terms for your surrender to us." The silence that followed was more profound than anything in recorded diplomatic history. The concept was so audacious, so completely beyond the realm of possibility, that several representatives couldn't process it through their translation matrices. "You cannot be serious," General Vexter managed eventually. "The Council commands the loyalty of billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. You represent a species that numbers fewer than 50 million individuals scattered across 17 colonies." Alina leaned forward slightly, her expression growing serious. "General, let me share some numbers with you. In the past year, human forces have conducted 2,847 successful operations against Council targets. We've captured or destroyed 312 of your military installations, disabled 89 of your major communication arrays, and disrupted trade in every sector of the galaxy." She paused, letting the statistics register. "More importantly, we've convinced 127 species to leave your alliance and join ours. We've inspired independence movements on 400 additional worlds. We've demonstrated to the entire galaxy that Council authority exists only as long as people choose to obey it." "And what have you lost in exchange?" she continued. "6 human vessels, 43 casualties, 1 colonial administration building on New Geneva that we abandoned when you finally worked up the courage to actually attack it." The mathematical reality was staggering. Humanity had fought the entire galactic establishment to a standstill while sustaining losses that barely registered as a rounding error. Dr. Cathara processed the implications with scientific precision. "The casualty ratios are impossible. No force can sustain that level of operational success without massive losses." "You're right," Alina agreed. "No conventional force could achieve these results, but we're not fighting conventionally. We're fighting for something you've never understood, the principle that free beings cannot be conquered by any force in the universe as long as they refuse to surrender." Admiral Threnx leaned forward aggressively. "Principles don't stop plasma cannons. Philosophy doesn't deflect particle beams. Your casualties are low because we've been restraining ourselves. If we implement Final Protocol 7, then you become the monsters you've spent 3,000 years pretending not to be," Alina interrupted. "And every species in the galaxy will know exactly what Council protection really means." She stood and walked to the chamber's observation window, gazing out at the stars that had become humanity's battlefield. "That's why you won't do it. Not because you can't, but because the moment you commit genocide to preserve your authority, you prove that authority was never legitimate in the first place." Chancellor Zephyros dimmed to confused purples. "What do you want, Ambassador Vasquez?" "I want you to remember what you've forgotten," Alina replied. 3,000 years ago, the Galactic Council was founded by species that had learned the hard way that cooperation was better than conquest. You were supposed to be a forum for voluntary coordination, not a government ruling over unwilling subjects. She turned back to face the assembled leadership. "Somewhere along the way, you forgot that consent is what makes authority legitimate. You started believing that stability justified suppressing freedom, that order was more important than justice, that your good intentions gave you the right to make decisions for beings who never asked for your guidance." The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words registered. The Council had indeed begun as a voluntary association of equals, but centuries of unchallenged authority had gradually transformed it into exactly the kind of tyrannical system it had originally been created to prevent. "So here are humanity's terms," Alina announced. "Complete dissolution of the Galactic Council as a governing body, immediate withdrawal of all Council military forces from non-member territories, recognition of the sovereign right of every species to determine its own government and foreign policy. In exchange, humanity offers to help establish a new voluntary association, a true forum for cooperation between equals, with no authority to compel obedience and no power beyond what member species voluntarily grant it." Admiral Threnx's scales darkened with rage. "You're demanding the destruction of galactic civilization." "No," Alina replied calmly. "I'm demanding its liberation. There's a difference." The debate that followed would be recorded as the moment when the old galactic order officially ended, and something entirely new began. For hours, the remaining council leadership argued, threatened, and pleaded with Alina to accept some form of compromise that would preserve their authority while acknowledging human independence. But Alina had not come to negotiate. She had come to deliver an ultimatum: evolve or become irrelevant. "You have one galactic standard year," she announced as she prepared to leave. "Use that time to transform the Council into something worth preserving, or watch it collapse entirely as more species choose freedom over security." As Alina walked toward the chamber exit, Chancellor Zephyros made one final attempt at intimidation. "What makes you so certain we won't simply destroy humanity rather than surrender our authority?" Alina paused at the doorway and looked back with genuine sadness. "Because you're not evil, Chancellor. Misguided, certainly. Arrogant, absolutely. But not evil. And deep down, you know we're right." She walked through the doorway and disappeared, leaving the Council leadership to contemplate the ruins of their 3,000-year empire. The year that followed became known as the Great Transition. Species after species chose independence over Council membership until the organization existed primarily on paper. The Free Species Alliance grew to encompass over 300 civilizations, while dozens more chose complete independence without formal alliance membership. Trade continued, communication networks expanded, and scientific cooperation flourished, all without central authority forcing coordination through threats of military action. The galaxy learned that voluntary cooperation was not only possible but more effective than coerced compliance. When the year of ultimatum expired, the Galactic Council formally dissolved itself. In its place emerged the Galactic Forum, a purely voluntary association with no military forces, no enforcement authority, and no power beyond what individual members chose to grant it for specific, limited purposes. Alina Vasquez attended the forum's founding ceremony as humanity's representative, taking the same seat she had occupied during her defiant speech 1 year earlier. But this time, she was surrounded by ambassadors from free species who had chosen cooperation over coercion, partnership over domination. As the ceremony concluded and representatives began departing for their home worlds, Chancellor Zephyros, now serving as the forum's first voluntary coordinator, approached Alina privately. "I still don't understand how you knew we wouldn't destroy humanity rather than surrender," he admitted, his energy form cycling through spectrums of genuine curiosity. Alina smiled, but this time it was warm rather than defiant. "Because you tried to rule us and we proved you couldn't. But we never tried to rule you in return. We offered you freedom instead of conquest, partnership instead of domination. And ultimately, that's the difference between authority and tyranny. Legitimate power serves those it governs, while illegitimate power serves only itself." As Alina departed for Earth, she left behind a galaxy transformed. Humanity had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had fought a war not to conquer their enemies, but to free them. And in proving that no force in the universe could compel free beings to surrender their liberty, they had taught the galaxy its most important lesson. Some things are worth more than life itself, and freedom is always worth the price of preserving it. The final entry in Alina's diplomatic log, transmitted throughout the galaxy as she returned to Earth, contained a simple message that would be remembered as long as sentient beings reached for the stars. To every species that chose freedom over security, cooperation over coercion, and independence over subjugation, welcome to the universe as it was meant to be. The galaxy is vast enough for all of us to pursue our own paths among the stars. And to those who still believe that authority comes from the barrel of a gun rather than the consent of the governed, humanity extends an open invitation to join us in freedom. Because ultimately, we're all the same, beings who dream of touching the stars and refuse to let anyone tell us we can't reach that high. This is Ambassador Alina Vasquez of the Free Species Alliance, signing off. The future belongs to those brave enough to choose it for themselves. The message ended, but its echo would reverberate through galactic civilization for millennia to come. Humanity had proven that freedom was not just a human value. It was a universal aspiration waiting for someone brave enough to fight for it. And once awakened, the dream of liberty could never be put back to sleep.